London had the habit of pretending that hearts were made of marble. Even the rain respected facades here. It struck the tall windows of Harland House and then politely slid away, leaving the glass shining and the truth untouched. Inside, a fire behaved as fires do in respectable homes, steady, moderate, never loud, while Adrian, Duke of Harland, sat at his desk and stared at the one thing in the room that did not match his life's arrangement. A letter sealed with pale blue wax and the imprint of a tiny wild rose. He knew the seal. His fingers knew it better than his eyes. He had last broken it 3 years ago, the night before pride became his religion. He did not open it at once. He poured tea he would not drink, turned a ledger he would not read, told himself he had no interest in dead gardens or soft blue wax or the scent that drifted up as if paper could remember spring. The letter had arrived an hour earlier, handed to him by a footman who avoided looking at his master's face. Everyone in the house knew, in the efficient way good houses do, that this was the kind of letter a man either burns or keeps forever. Adrian only held it, thumb against the rise of the seal, as if the smallest pressure might be forgiveness. From the corridor beyond the study door came the routine noises of a life that had learned to walk around grief, a maid's quick steps, the muted clink of china, the polite cough of the butler. They were proof that time existed. He had not felt entirely sure of that lately. Grief had turned the world into a pond, frozen just enough to hold a man whose feet were tired and whose eyes were clear. He remembered very well the last clear sentence he had said to the woman who wrote this letter. "I will never forgive you, Eliza." He had spoken it evenly, like a judge delivering a sentence meant to sound like a fact of nature. He laid the envelope flat and finally slit the seal with his father's small silver knife. There were 3 pages, carefully folded, written in a hand he had watched 100 times while a quill paused over a word and then chose it with elegant certainty. The first line was not an apology, and this, absurdly, unnerved him more than any confession might have. "Adrian, I have learned that truth is not a door that opens when you knock, but a window that must be unlatched from within. You never asked me to open mine. I do not blame you. Here is the latch." He stood because some sentences require a man to change positions. The fire made its small, disciplined sounds. He read the next lines with the carefulness one gives to prayers one is not sure one believes. "You swore you would never forgive me, and I accepted your oath because I understood what you thought you saw. I write only because a life can go wrong in silence, and I have carried too much of it. If this letter angers you, burn it. If it wounds you, I am already sorry. But if it opens even a crack of the window, read on." Memories did not knock. They arrived, like weather. He saw her as she had been the first spring he knew her, Eliza Ashdown, standing beneath the beech trees at Westmoreland, with petals in her hair, as if spring had not yet decided whether they belonged to the branches or to her. She was a baron's daughter, with more intellect than dowry and more courage than caution. He had proposed in a garden because he had not believed he would ever need walls again. They had planned a life made of simple words. 2 cups, 1 table, 1 world that keeps the same weather on both sides. Then, one evening at a ball, he had turned, watched her disappear through a side door with a man in a dark coat, followed minutes later to hear voices that sounded like secrets, and the world had obliged him by becoming cold. If there had been a question, he had not asked it. Some men ask. He judged. It felt like strength at the time. He lowered the first page, closed his eyes, and listened to the house. It did not listen back. He read again. "I did not betray you. I will not soften the sentence with flowers. My absence looked like betrayal because I chose silence. I chose it to keep a man alive who deserved imprisonment, not death. The man you saw was not a lover. He was my brother, and he had done a reckless thing for which your name might have paid. I begged him to run, and he did. I took the disgrace because disgrace is sometimes cheaper than the truth when the truth would ruin more than a girl's reputation." He felt the room tilt slightly, as if a ship had left harbor and told him late. Brother. The word arrived like a coat he had not known was his size. He leaned one hand on the desk, touched the edge of the paper as if it might dissolve, and read on because stopping would have been more dangerous than continuing. You once asked me why I wore a locket with no miniature inside. I told you I was waiting to deserve the picture. Inside that empty locket I kept the train ticket that carried him away from London. I have worn your quiet salvation at my throat for 3 years. If this condemns me, I accept it. But if you have believed I loved you lightly, please put that belief down. It is too heavy for you to carry and untrue enough to wound you twice. He remembered the locket. He remembered touching it once with the caution of a man who understands that some doors lead directly to tenderness. You keep nothing in it? He had asked then, half smiling, half afraid. Not nothing, she had said, and turned the conversation with the art of a woman who understood that some truths need proper rooms. The rain sounded different now, a little more like a conversation and less like judgment. He turned to the second page. I left, because leaving you seemed the only way to save your father's name from scandal and your tenants from new landlords who would have eaten them alive. Pride told me you would come after me and demand answers. When you did not, I decided that silence was the last good act I could give you. I have done many things badly, Adrian, but I have tried to love you in ways that cost you least. He read the sentence twice, not for meaning but for temperature. I have tried to love you in ways that cost you least. It was the kind of sentence a man might spend a decade understanding. He was not sure he deserved it, but he understood it had been given. The third page was short. I'm leaving London for the coast. If you wish to answer, address your letter to the school at St. Mears. The mistress will know where to send it. If you choose silence, I will understand. Do not be cruel to yourself on my account. I have learned enough to carry my own weather. E. He folded the letter with the precision of a man healing something small first, because the larger wound frightened him. Then he placed it on the desk and walked to the window. The garden beyond had the disciplined look of places that have learned to bloom without applause. Evergreens kept their agreements with winter. Gravel paths remembered feet that had not walked them in months. He could see where, in spring, the roses would stage their old, expensive arguments with the thorns. Behind him, the door opened half a hand's width. Your Grace? The butler's voice was a discreet inquiry, not a footstep. Shall I bring luncheon? No, Adrian said, and then surprised himself by adding, Have my horse saddled. The door closed. He looked again at the letter, then at the map case in the corner. He did not take out a map. He knew the way to St. Mears as a man knows the way to an old wound. He had once ridden that road north with a head full of explanations to give a woman he loved. Now he would ride it with questions and a heart that had finally remembered how to ask them. For a moment, he imagined not going. Pride is a very loyal servant. It will guard a man against happiness with a dedication that looks like honor. But the rain had changed its sound, and the house had acquired that particular emptiness homes get when an owner chooses the wrong kind of quiet. He took the letter up and slipped it into the inner pocket of his coat, as a soldier might tuck orders near his ribs. On the front steps, he paused. The stable boy, red-cheeked and eager, held the reins of a dark bay that tossed its head as if it had opinions. Weather's breaking, Your Grace, the boy said. Let it, Adrian answered and swung into the saddle. As the hooves struck the wet street, the city revealed itself the way cities do when one is newly attentive. Shopkeepers adjusting awnings, a girl with ink on her fingers, laughing at a joke too small for history, a man in a poor coat tipping his hat out of habit and dignity. He wondered how many truths he had missed because they had not matched the picture he preferred. Far from London, in a rented room that smelled of soap and chalk and strong tea, Eliza pressed her palm against the window and watched a group of girls run between puddles in the schoolyard, their ribbons turning ordinary weather into ceremony. She had not expected to write, but some silences are successful only until mercy breaks them. When she finished the letter, she had sealed it with the last of the blue wax and the little stamp she kept wrapped in a handkerchief, the wild rose, stubborn and unmanageable, blooming where it had no permission. She did not cry. She had learned economy from sorrow. Instead, she set the room in order, not because rooms comfort grief, but because order is the only argument some days understand. On the mantel stood a small porcelain vase with a chipped lip. In it, 3 wintering sprigs of rosemary tried to be green. She touched them, breathed their sharpness, and fell briefly into the gentle ache of then. A summer picnic, his laugh when a bee mistook his coat for a flower, the way he had knotted his cravat without a mirror and still looked like a promise. She stepped away before memory could become a habit. "Miss Ashdown?" The schoolmistress appeared at the door, spectacles shining like tiny shields. "The girls ask if you will read to them after dinner." "Of course," Eliza said. "Something brave, I think." "Brave is your specialty," the mistress smiled and was gone. Eliza looked at her hands. The left one bore a faint scar across the knuckle where she had once broken a fall in a hallway too empty for safety. She flexed her fingers and thought of the man in London who had sworn never to forgive her, and of the boy who had once whispered nonsense against her throat because happiness makes poets of the practical. She did not know whether he would read the letter. She did know that if he did not, the world would continue to turn, and she with it. That was the shape of the strength she had purchased at such cost, to live even where love had not stayed. But she had also learned to spare herself no kindnesses that did not spoil the truth. She allowed one. At night she laid the locket on the bedside table and opened it, not for the empty space within, but for the small folded ticket hidden behind the hinge, proof that a brother had escaped, proof that a woman's ruin had bought something other than sorrow. Tonight, perhaps, she would tuck into the locket a scrap of blue wax to keep the wild rose company. Outside, the sky reconsidered itself and allowed a seam of sunlight to appear. She smiled, not at omens. The world is too untidy for those, but at the comfort of a brief, bright line. "Brave," she said aloud, trying the word in her mouth the way one tries tea to see if it is cooled enough. "Yes, we will be brave again." Back in London, the Duke bent his head against the soft new rain and rode south. Between his ribs the letter was warm, before the anger, before the silence, before the word forgiveness ever needed to exist. There had been laughter. London was still young that year, or at least it felt so to those who believed in its music. The season had opened with dances, dinners in the kind of polite chaos that gives people the illusion that fate has manners. Eliza Ashdown had been invited not because she was wealthy, she was not, but because her aunt believed that every ballroom needed at least one honest pair of eyes. And Eliza's were precisely that, clear, curious, unafraid. That evening, she had worn a gown the color of crushed lavender, stitched by her own hand, and when she descended the staircase of the Ashdown townhouse, her aunt had sighed as if beauty were a nuisance. "Do not speak too much," she had advised. "Men dislike clever women." Eliza had smiled. "Then I shall be perfectly safe." Across the ballroom, Adrian Harland, the Duke of Harland, had not intended to dance. Dukes rarely do. He was a man who had inherited not only land, but the kind of reputation that could silence a room. Tall, composed, with a face that looked as if it had been carved out of patience, he spent most of his evenings in conversation with men twice his age about things he no longer believed in: politics, breeding lines, loyalty. But that night, something cracked the smooth surface of his boredom, a sound like sunlight made into laughter. He turned, and there she was, not standing among the debutantes who floated like petals in pale gowns, but near the musicians, smiling down at a small boy who had dropped his ribboned mask. She knelt, tied it again for him, and said something that made the child beam before running off. When she stood, their eyes met. He bowed. She hesitated, then curtsied, and the air between them decided to change its rules. "Your Grace," she said, though her voice carried more steadiness than reverence. He inclined his head. "You seem to have saved the evening from tragedy. A lost mask might have brought the empire to its knees." "A crisis averted," she replied, amused. "Perhaps the country will survive until morning." Something in her tone, light, teasing, but not foolish, made him forget how conversations were supposed to go. "Would you grant me the next dance?" "Are you sure, Your Grace? My steps are often ahead of the music." "Then the music should learn to keep up." That was how it began, not with grand declarations, but with small defiance. As the orchestra began a waltz, the room parted in quiet curiosity. People whispered as the Duke, the man known for avoiding gossip as if it were contagious, took the hand of an unremarkably connected woman with lavender eyes and too much laughter in her posture. The first notes lifted like wings, and they moved together as if rhythm had remembered them from another life. You lead too gently, she said, and you follow too fearlessly. Perhaps we'll balance each other out. Perhaps. By the time the music ended, something irreversible had happened. The rest of the night unfolded like a confession whispered in fragments, a walk on the terrace, the scent of roses just before. Rain, the Duke's voice quieter than the world had ever heard it. He asked for her name again, though he already knew it. She asked why he looked like a man who never rested, even while standing still. He answered, "Because rest is for men who have nothing to lose." "And what about love?" she asked. He smiled, though his eyes betrayed thought. "Love is for the reckless." "Then perhaps," she said softly, "I'll have to teach you how." From that night, society began to notice. Invitations appeared addressed to both. The gossip columns called her the Lavender Lady, a name that both amused and embarrassed her. For the first time, Adrian found himself impatient for daylight, for the excuses that allowed him to visit her aunt's house, to sit across from Eliza with tea between them and talk about books instead of boundaries. He learned that she painted badly but loved the attempt, that she quoted poets when nervous, that she had once ridden bareback through a field just to prove that freedom wasn't only for men. And she learned that beneath his stillness there was a man who had taught himself to command everything except happiness. One afternoon, they walked through the gardens of Westmoreland. The sky had chosen a gray that made her gown seem almost luminous. They spoke of nothing remarkable, weather, books, the peculiar habit of roses blooming late that year. Then, as if driven by a quiet certainty, Adrian stopped and turned toward her. "Miss Ashdown," he said, and for the first time, his voice betrayed something close to fear. "I find myself lacking patience for slow discoveries." She frowned slightly, though her heart had already guessed. "And what is it you wish to discover quickly, Your Grace?" "Whether the rest of my life might interest you." Her breath caught. "That depends," she said, her wit softening into wonder. "Would it include laughter?" "It would have to," he answered. "It's what I have come to depend on." When he kissed her hand, she felt as though the world had exhaled, and when he asked, in his deliberate, measured tone, if she would marry him, she did not need to think. "Yes," she said, smiling as the first drops of rain began to fall, "before I have time to doubt my luck." Rain fell harder, soaking through silk and dignity, but neither cared. He drew her close under his coat, and she laughed again, that same sound that had first found him across a crowded ballroom. Later, when they told the story, people would remember the proposal in the rain, the Duke who smiled for the first time, the lady who dared to laugh at thunder. But no one remembered what she had whispered against his chest, words only he had heard. "Promise me," she had said, "if we ever lose each other, we will find our way back through truth, not pride." And he had sworn, as all men in love do, believing promises are stronger than the people who make them. For months after, they were inseparable. Letters passed when propriety demanded distance, each sealed with her blue wax and his crest of thorns. Dinners, music, sunlight, laughter, all the illusions that happiness uses to disguise itself as permanence. But beneath the perfection, something else had begun. Tiny misunderstandings, small absences. The Duke's duties called him away often, and Eliza, proud and independent, refused to follow him into circles that would have treated her as an ornament. They loved, yes, but they also assumed. And assumptions, like fine china, look eternal until the first crack appears. Summer dressed London for a party the night it decided to break them. The Ashdowns' midsummer ball glittered as if applause could be threaded into light. Chandeliers spilled wine-colored brilliance across polished floors. Musicians pulled silk from their strings, and laughter perfected its disguises. The air smelled of roses and candle smoke and the sweet, dangerous certainty that happiness was a permanent address. Eliza arrived in a gown of moonlit ivory, hair caught up with pearl-tipped pins, and a ribbon the exact shade of lavender he loved. Adrian had never looked more at ease. Black coat, clean lines, a cravat tied without vanity. When he claimed her for the opening waltz, the room quietly licensed hope. They danced as if they were explaining to the world how bodies can speak without betraying secrets. She followed with fearless grace. He led with gentleness he had reserved only for her. On the final turn, he bent to murmur what the future would look like if the world behaved. September in the country. the beech trees turning, letters until then, promises after. She smiled, and for a private second, they existed in a small, unassailable nation called us. Then, duty tapped his shoulder. A messenger, pale with apology, brought a card from a cabinet undersecretary who wished to speak in the card room on a matter requiring a moment of your grace's discretion. Adrian touched Eliza's hand. 2 minutes, he promised. Do not let anyone convince you to be charming while I am away. She arched a brow. Impossible. I saved my worst behavior for you. He left on that smile. The undersecretary's moment multiplied, as such moments do when power is trying to excuse itself. Grain shipments, river levels, a vote no one could count yet. Adrian gave 3 answers and received 5 half-truths disguised as gratitude. When he returned to the ballroom, 14 minutes by the tall clock, a lifetime by his chest, he did not immediately see her. The waltz had changed, faces had rearranged, the orchestra flirted with a reel. He looked for lavender ribbon, for the quicksilver movement that belonged to her. She was not in the room. A servant passed. Adrian's gaze caught on a side door opening to the columned colonnade that led toward the service corridors and the smaller, darker anterooms where tired guests went to breathe. The door closed again with the particular hush of a secret. He crossed the floor without remembering to be elegant. At the far end of the colonnade, moonlight made rectangles on stone. A shadow moved where a narrow corridor turned left, swift, slight, familiar. He heard the low urgency of a woman's voice. He heard his name. Adrian cannot know, Eliza said, the words soft but edged. If he is seen near this at all, they will devour him. A man's answer, frayed with panic. Ellie, please, he'll forgive. Forgiveness won't save him from Parliament. Go. The world compressed to a point. Adrian did not think. Thinking is a polite luxury in the presence of shock. He moved closer, unseen, his back to the wall, and saw them. Eliza, her hand gripping the arm of a man in a dark traveling coat, face half hidden by a hat pulled low. The man's jaw was unshaven. His eyes, when he risked a glance toward the light, carried the wildness of those who have been running too long. Eliza's cheeks were pale, her mouth set in the determined line he had admired when she confronted petty cruelties at dinners. Now that same line looked like a border between him and the truth. The man caught her hand and pressed it quickly, desperately to his lips. I'll write, he whispered, when I can. You'll vanish, she answered, which is the same mercy by another name. She pulled free, thrust a small packet into his hands, papers, money, the stained honesty of necessary help. Go through the service gate. The cab waits 2 streets over. If anyone asks, you are no one. Adrian's vision tunneled, a stranger's mouth on her hand, the plea in a name no one else used. Ellie. The packet, the caution, the ceremonial intimacy of a parting. He could have stepped forward. He could have said her name quietly and trusted the person who had taught him gentleness. Instead, he became the version of himself that had once survived a world of wolves, hard, fast, certain. The man fled toward the service stairs. Eliza stood a moment, breathing as if she had been underwater. When she turned, Adrian was there, carved out of fury so controlled it looked like calm. She stopped as if she had collided with a wall she hadn't known existed. Adrian, she said, recovering nothing but poise. You startled me. Did I? He considered the word like a new term in a language he didn't wish to learn. I might say the evening startled me. The corridor. The company. He gestured toward the darkness where the stranger had gone, a small, precise movement that insulted without raising his voice. Farewell. Color rose and fell in her face. You overheard. I saw. The 2 syllables hit colder than any accusation. And I saw enough to correct an error. What error? My belief in you. Silence widened, cruel with options. She closed the distance between them by 1 step, not to beg, but to choose clarity. Adrian, listen to me. That man is not my concern, he interrupted. I do not possess an interest in a list of particulars that will busy my mind and insult my intelligence. Do you love him? She reeled as if struck. No. Did you meet him in secret? Touch him? Offer him money? Hide him from my sight? Each question landed like a snapped thread. Her voice stayed low, dignified, because she refused it the relief of anger. Yes. Then our definitions of betrayal differ only by poetry. He straightened, the motion of a judge remembering the book in which verdicts are kept. You might have chosen honesty. I chose protection, she said. Yours. Of all the stories available to you, you select that one. He gave a small, disbelieving laugh. And who is he that my safety requires your treachery? She lifted her chin. My brother. The word fell between them like a key that would have opened a door had he not already bricked it over. Something in his face, some muscle near the mouth that gave him away in sleep, twitched. But pride is quicker than doubt. You expect me to accept that? I expect you to remember who I am, and that I do not lie. People become strangers while insisting they are not, he said. This is the first mercy betrayal offers. Her fingers tightened around the ribbon at her waist until her knuckles shone. Come with me then, now. I will tell you everything. She glanced toward the door to the colonnade, toward the corridor where truth waited with consequences she was prepared to bear at last. I cannot in the middle of a ballroom, not with his life in the balance. His life concerns you more than my trust, he said. Your trust is what I am trying to save, by extinguishing it. The orchestra, somewhere far away, began a new reel. A laugh carried down the corridor with the confidence of those who would never be required to choose between two impossible goods. Eliza took another step toward him, and he smelled the faint, clean scent of lavender that had been the first thing he'd loved that was not a duty. Do you remember what I asked you the day you proposed? She said softly. That if we were ever lost, we would find our way back through truth, not pride. It should have been enough. Perhaps on a different night, smaller and kinder, it would have been. But humiliation had already recruited memory. His mind replayed the kiss on her hand, as if a jury needed more evidence to justify a verdict it had chosen for the pleasure of choosing. I remember, he said. I also remember what you promised, to choose me. He glanced again at the darkness where her brother had vanished, as if jealousy were a dog that needed a direction to bark. Tonight I have learned the meaning of your promises. Adrian, she said, his name the sound of mercy preparing to kneel, please, come inside with me. 5 minutes and the puiti. Truth will be safe in your hands. I beg you. Do not punish us because you were asked to wait. Something inside him flinched at the word beg. He despised it near her mouth. He mistook that protective impulse for righteous anger and found himself grateful for the error. I do not beg, he said, and I do not forgive what does not repent. I'm not asking forgiveness for a sin I did not commit, she replied, voice steady now. I'm asking faith for a truth I'm ready to tell. And I'm asking nothing, he said quietly, because nothing is what I have left for you. He stepped aside, granting her passage not as courtesy but as dismissal. She looked at him for a long second, cataloging not the man but the wall he had decided to become. If you walk away, she said, you will regret it. Regret is the luxury of fools, he answered. I will manage without it. He left her in the shadowed corridor and returned to the ballroom where light forgave everything except honesty. He found the undersecretary again, spoke of grain as if bread were the only thing men ever lost. Behind his eyes, a small, disciplined conflagration consumed every letter she had written, every laugh he had stored for winters. When the Ashdown's clock chimed midnight, society sighed, sated by spectacle and sweets. Adrian sent his valet for the carriage, escorted his aunt to the stairs, and maintained the expression of a man who has decided to believe pain is only a rumor. Eliza did not return to the ballroom. Later, her aunt would explain she had been indisposed. Later, a servant would swear he saw Miss Ashdown going down the service steps with no cloak, only dignity to keep her warm. Later, gossip would locate her in every version of disgrace it needed to practice. But that night, in that hour, only 2 people knew the shape of the wound, and each believed the other had cut it. At dawn, a footman delivered a small parcel to Harland House, her locket, the ribbon severed cleanly, the empty hinge light as an accusation. No note, no scene. He placed it on his desk and looked at it the way men look at the past when they have chosen to call it a lie. When his aunt asked after Miss Ashdown, he smiled politely and said the wedding would not proceed. When a friend attempted sympathy, Adrian poured him wine and offered the weather. To the only person whose opinion he trusted, himself, he issued a verdict. I will never forgive her, he said to the empty study, and the sentence fit his mouth the way iron fits a gate. Heavy, certain, closed. Outside, summer pretended to continue. Roses rehearsed their bright arguments with thorns. Carriages confessed to nothing as they clattered by. And somewhere in a small room behind a school, a woman who did not cry folded a train ticket into a locket and decided silence could be a kind of courage, at least for a while. The while would last 3 years. Then a letter, sealed with pale blue wax, and a wild rose would arrive and teach two proud people the difference between truth delayed and truth denied. But that was later. On the night everything broke, pride won the first battle precisely because it promised the easiest peace. It always does, until it doesn't. Time, when it wishes to punish, does not rush. It stretches itself into the fine lines of faces and the still corners of rooms. For Adrian Harland, the days after the midsummer ball arranged themselves with military obedience. Breakfast at 9, correspondence at 10, estate matters until noon. He learned to live inside calendars instead of moments. Society was kind to him in the way it is kind to men with titles. It accepted his solitude as distinction. Invitations came, and he declined with courteous lies about health, travel, and the demands of Parliament. When he did attend, he stood at the edge of rooms, polite as architecture, listening to conversations that never reached him. Sometimes a lady would attempt conversation. They say the Duke of Harland is impossible to move. He would smile slightly. Then perhaps I'm exactly where I belong. No one suspected that what anchored him was not duty, but memory. In private, he was not a man but a museum. Her laughter, the scent of lavender, the echo of footsteps in a corridor, each carefully preserved, each untouched. He had replaced affection with perfection, because the past is easier to love when it cannot answer back. At night, he worked until exhaustion made obedience look like peace. But peace never came, only sleep, and even that shallow. In dreams she stood beneath the beech trees, not turning toward him, always a little too far away. He would wake with his hand clenched as if trying to hold a memory that had learned to walk. He told himself that forgiveness was unnecessary, that some wrongs lose their importance if one refuses to name them. Yet he kept the locket, the one she returned, on his desk. He told servants it was an heirloom, a trinket of no value. But sometimes, when the house was silent enough, he would touch it just once to confirm that regret still had weight. The city around him moved forward. New fashions arrived. New names replaced old ones in the gossip sheets. The world was rearranging itself without asking for his permission. Then came the portrait. It was at a winter exhibition, a charity event he attended out of obligation. The painting was called The Governess. It showed a woman seated near a window, light falling across her face. She wore no jewels, no title, only dignity. Her hair, auburn and uncooperative, was pinned loosely, and her eyes held something both defiant and tired. He knew them instantly. The artist had captured her not as she had been, not the laughing girl in lavender, but as she might be now, older, quieter, weathered by courage. He left before the crowd noticed, the carriage door shut like an oath. That night, he burned a decade's worth of letters he had written but never sent. The smoke smelled faintly of wax and paper and relief, but the relief was brief. Far from London, Eliza lived a smaller story that required greater strength. The first months after the scandal were cruel in their simplicity. Her aunt's doors closed, her friends learned new loyalties, and whispers became walls. She left quietly, taking nothing except her mother's silver hair comb, the empty locket, and a letter from her brother confirming he was safe in Belgium. She found work at St. Mere's School for Girls, where the rooms smelled of chalk and seawater. The headmistress, Mrs. Talbot, hired her after a single interview. "You look like a woman who has stopped waiting for permission," she said. "That's what these girls need." Eliza taught literature and handwriting, though what she truly taught was composure. The girls loved her because she looked at them as if each could one day matter to the world. Her classroom was filled with laughter, though none of it reached the part of her heart that once belonged to spring gardens and ballroom waltzes. Every year she planted lavender by the school fence. "It reminds me," she told the girls, "that beauty can survive salt air." At night, she wrote letters she never sent. One began, "I am well, Adrian." That is both a truth and a disguise. Another said, "You believed a lie, but I do not wish you to be smaller because of it." She folded them neatly and locked them in a wooden box beneath her bed, a small graveyard for unspoken courage. When her brother wrote again, she answered simply, "Do not return. Some wars end better without witnesses." 3 winters passed. The seasons repeated their routines as if trying to teach her detachment. She grew used to quiet mornings, to ink-stained fingertips, to the company of girls who dreamed of being painters, poets, or wives, the 3 professions society considered equally impractical. She smiled often, but her smiles were well-disciplined, and yet there were moments that betrayed her strength. Once she found an old issue of the London Gazette at the market, its edges yellowed, its ink fading. In the society pages she saw his name, the Duke of Harland, to host winter fete at Harland House. Beneath it, a sketch, not of his face, but of his crest. She traced the lines with her thumb and then, very quietly, bought the paper. That night she read it again before burning it in the hearth. "You're still alive," she whispered to the flame. "So am I. That will have to be enough." In the 4th year, London began to whisper her name again, but kindly this time. The portrait titled "The Governess" had traveled back to the city, praised for its realism and soul. No one knew the model's name. That anonymity gave her back a kind of freedom she hadn't expected. She was now a mystery admired, not a scandal survived. Mrs. Talbot received a letter offering Eliza a position in London, teaching at a newly founded academy for the daughters of merchants. "You could start again," the headmistress said. "No one would know." Eliza smiled faintly. "I'm not sure I'd know how to be new anymore." Still, she accepted, not for reinvention, but for closure. When she returned to the city, the streets looked narrower, the carriages louder, but London smelled the same, rain on stone, ink, and perfume. She rented a modest room above a bookshop on Whitcomb Street. Her days filled again with lessons, laughter, and the distant hum of life. Then one afternoon, as she arranged papers on her desk, she noticed a young woman, a maid, perhaps 17, standing at the door holding an envelope. "For you, miss," the girl said, delivered by hand, said it was urgent. Eliza's gaze fell to the seal, blue wax pressed with the wild rose she had not used in years. Her hands trembled slightly. She closed the door, set the letter on the table, and sat perfectly still. Outside, carriages rolled by, and the world continued, indifferent. For several minutes, she simply looked at it, the handwriting she had once loved for its precision, the familiar initials, A.A., H. When she finally opened it, the words blurred, not from tears, but from disbelief. "Eliza, if time were a man, I would call him cruel for keeping you from me this long. I have learned the truth. I know now what I refused to hear then. You were not my ruin. You were my salvation disguised as pain. If forgiveness is still possible, let me earn it. I will come to you, unless you command otherwise. Adrian." The letter fell from her hand. She stood, crossed the small room, and opened the window. The air smelled of rain again. "He swore he'd never forgive me," she whispered, her voice a mix of wonder and fear. And yet, the wind took the words. She did not cry. Instead, she folded the letter carefully, set it beside the locket on her nightstand, and lit a single candle. In its flickering glow, her reflection in the window looked younger for a moment, not in years, but in hope. The silence between them had lasted 4 years. But silence, like pride, has an expiration date. And somewhere in London, a man who had spent years talking only to his regrets was already saddling his horse. The journey to St. Mears had taken him 2 days of rain and reconsideration. For Adrian Harland, every mile south felt like a confession. The landscape blurred, hedgerows, small cottages, the smoke of quiet lives lived without grandeur. He had once believed distance could protect a man from his own mistakes. Now he understood that pride was only another form of cowardice wearing a duke's insignia. When his horse finally slowed before the school's gates, the storm had gentled into drizzle. Beyond the fence, a few girls ran with their skirts gathered in their hands, laughing at the sky. Laughter, it struck him like déjà vu. Then, among the roses near the old stone arch, He saw her. She was carrying a bundle of papers, her hair half loosened by the wind, and though the years had etched their signatures in the corners of her eyes, she looked more alive than any memory had dared to be. No jewels, no title, just Eliza, the one truth he had never managed to unlearn. He dismounted before she saw him. The gravel shifted beneath his boots. She turned, first with curiosity, then stillness, then the kind of disbelief that erases words. "Adrian," she breathed. He bowed too formally, because formality is what men reach for when courage trembles. "Miss Ashdown." Silence gathered like witnesses around them. The wind moved through the lavender bushes, releasing the scent that had outlived both of them. "I received your letter," she said at last, her voice calm but cautious, like a bridge testing its weight. "I meant every word," he replied. "The words seem poor currency now." She looked down briefly, adjusting the papers in her hands. "I wasn't certain you'd come. I wasn't certain I deserved to." The honesty in that sentence startled even him. Eliza gestured toward the garden bench near the fence. "We might speak there. The girls will think you a benefactor." He smiled faintly. "Perhaps in a way I am, trying to restore what I ruined." They sat. Between them lay the distance of 4 years, and all the letters never sent. For a long moment, neither spoke. The world itself seemed to pause, listening. Then, Adrian drew from his coat the letter she had written, the blue wax now cracked, the paper worn from being unfolded too many times. He placed it on the bench between them. "You wrote this to save me, and I, in my wisdom, punished you for it." She looked at the letter, not touching it. "I never expected you to read it. I only needed to write it." He turned toward her. "And yet when I read it, I found the man I thought I had lost, not the one you loved, but the one I could have been if I had trusted you." Her breath caught. "You speak as if it were so simple now." "It is never simple," he said, "but I've had years to realize that pride offers comfort only to the empty." She smiled sadly. "And forgiveness offers comfort only to the brave." He studied her face, not as a man studies beauty, but as a scholar studies truth. "Then let us try to be brave together, just this once." Her hands tightened on the papers. "Before you forgive me, you should know the rest. My brother lives still, in France now, married, respectable. The night you saw us, he had come to tell me he had taken documents from one of your political rivals. Dangerous ones. I begged him to flee before scandal touched your name. I gave him money that was mine, not yours. I hid him, because the law would have hanged him and ruined you. That was the truth I could not shout in a ballroom full of ears." He closed his eyes, shame pressing like fever behind his ribs. And I was too proud to ask. I saw only what confirmed my fear, not what disproved it. Eliza's voice softened. "We both mistook silence for safety." "Yes," he whispered, "and it killed everything it touched." A faint laugh escaped her, not cruel, not bitter, but weary. "You sound like a poet now. Has London finally bored you into humility?" He looked at her then, and something broke quietly between them, a smile, a sigh, a recognition. "Perhaps it has. Or perhaps losing you was the only lesson long enough to teach me." They sat in the rain-scented stillness, and time, for the first time in years, felt honest. "Why now?" she asked softly. "After all this time?" "Because regret," he said, "is a debt that collects interest." Her eyes glistened, but she did not turn away. "And what would you have me do with this truth now that you finally want it?" He hesitated, not for words, but for worthiness. "Let me carry it with you, not to erase what was done, but to stop it from defining what remains." She looked at him for a long time, long enough for forgiveness to begin, not as an act, but as recognition. Then she stood, the papers pressed to her chest. "I must teach a lesson soon. My girls wait for me." He rose as well, understanding that time had not granted him permission to demand anything. "Then let me walk you to the door." The path was narrow, lined with lavender, the air alive with salt from the distant sea. "I thought of you," she said quietly, "more often than I wished." He exhaled, a small trembling sound. "And I thought of you more honestly than I deserved." At the school steps, she paused. "You spoke of earning forgiveness. That cannot be done in a single visit." "I know," he said, "but perhaps I can start by listening." Eliza studied him, the same eyes that once turned ballrooms to silence, now holding humility instead of pride. "Then listen well, Adrian. I do not hate you. I never did. What I could not forgive was your certainty." He bowed his head. "Then I will learn uncertainty if that's the price." A faint smile ghosted across her lips. "It is not a price. It is the beginning." From inside, the school bell rang, echoing like a benediction through the gray sky. The sound made her laugh softly. "My lesson calls." "And mine," he said. "Only mine is much overdue." As she disappeared through the doorway, he looked once more at the garden, at the lavender trembling in the breeze. He had come for forgiveness, but found something larger, understanding. He touched the pocket where her letter still rested and whispered to the wind, "You saved me long before I ever knew I needed saving." From the window above, she watched him leave, his figure fading into the mist that blurred sky and sea together. She did not call out. Some goodbyes are too sacred to speak, but as he rode away, she placed her palm over her heart and felt something she had not allowed herself in years: hope, quiet, patient, and alive. The road from St. Mears was little more than a thread of gray stretching between fields still damp from the morning storm. Adrian Harland rode slowly, reins loose, coat darkened by the fine mist that refused to decide whether it was rain or fog. He had left the school quietly, almost reverently, as if sound itself might offend what had just been mended. Behind him lay 4 years of silence. Ahead, only the uncertain kindness of the present. The first mile passed in thought, the second in confession. He had spent years building himself into an edifice, marble manners, iron reason, stone heart, and now every hoofbeat seemed to chip at that facade. "You were not my ruin. You were my salvation disguised as pain." Her words echoed with the patience of truth. They did not accuse, only existed, as steady as the rhythm of the horse beneath him. He remembered how she had looked in the garden, no powder, no jewels, no artifice, and realized that time had not diminished her. It had made her real. He wondered if she would ever know how much smaller the world felt after she left it. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and salt. Far off, thunder muttered like an old complaint. Adrian drew up his collar and let the rain find him. It began softly, tapping the brim of his hat, soaking into his gloves, blurring the lines between road and sky. He did not hurry. The rain felt like penance he no longer wished to avoid. In his youth, he had thought storms an inconvenience, interruptions to order. Now he understood their mercy. They erase tracks. They give everything a chance to begin again. He thought of his father, a man carved from principle, who had once told him, "Harlands do not apologize, we correct." For years he had obeyed that creed, mistaking correction for control. But as rain ran down his face, Adrian realized that some mistakes could not be corrected. They could only be forgiven, and forgiveness was never an act of command. He dismounted near a small chapel at the roadside, an old stone place, half swallowed by ivy, its door ajar as if faith itself were tired of being guarded. He tied his horse beneath the eaves and stepped inside. The air was cold, heavy with wax and memory. He removed his gloves, flexing fingers stiff from rain. The only light came from a single candle flickering before a wooden cross. He was not a devout man. Belief had always seemed to him another language he never learned. Yet, standing there, soaked and silent, he found himself speaking aloud. "Forgive me," he said quietly, to no one, and perhaps to everything. Not for doubting her, for believing so little in myself that doubt was easier. The words startled him with their accuracy. He had never said them, not even in thought. They filled the small chapel, simple and sufficient. Outside, lightning stitched the horizon, and the answering thunder arrived almost tenderly. Adrian smiled, a small, uncertain curve of the mouth. "I will take that as acknowledgement," he murmured, and stepped back into the rain. The road glistened like a mirror. He saw his reflection in the puddles, blurred, unguarded, mortal. Pride looked absurd on such a face. He laughed softly, the sound mingling with the patter of water. He wrote again, and the rain grew heavier, each drop a reminder of what he was leaving behind. At one point, he removed the glove from his right hand and reached into his coat for her letter. The paper was already worn soft from travel. He read a single line by memory rather than sight. "If it wounds you, I am already sorry." He folded it, pressed it against his chest, and whispered, "It doesn't wound anymore." The sky broke open properly then. Sheets of rain fell, drumming on the world like absolution. He let it. There was no sense in resisting grace when it finally arrived. Hours later, he reached an inn at the edge of the next county, a low, timbered place with a crooked sign that promised shelter and little else. He entered dripping, hat in hand. The innkeeper's wife, a broad, cheerful woman, gasped, "You're drenched, sir. You'll catch your death." "I've already caught my life," he said, surprising himself again, and she laughed, thinking him another eccentric noble on a poetic errand. By the fire, he sat with brandy and quiet. The other travelers spoke of crops and politics. Adrian listened without listening, content to let their words fill the room. His attention lingered on the window, where rain traced slow silver lines down the glass. He thought of Eliza, not the woman he had lost, but the one he had found again, strong, steady, unafraid of solitude. He wondered if she was looking at the same storm. He realized, with gentle astonishment, that he did not need to know. Love did not require witness to exist. It simply was. The next morning dawned clean, the world smelling of renewal. Mist hung low over the fields, and the first sunlight turned every drop of water into a jewel. Adrian mounted his horse again, lighter somehow, as if forgiveness had physical weight, and he'd set it down. As he rode, he composed a letter in his mind, not a plea, not an apology, but an acknowledgement. Eliza, if I once spoke of love as possession, understand that I have learned it is not a cage, but a compass. You were always right about truth. It is the only road worth losing oneself upon. If you will have me in your friendship, I will count it grace. If more, I will count it miracle. He did not yet know if he would send it. Some letters are meant only for the heart that writes them. But he smiled at the thought that, should he ever write again, the words would finally come from a man she could respect. The road bent westward, toward London. The city awaited him, still filled with its noise, its politics, its gilded distractions. But for the first time in years he did not dread its walls. He would return, resume his duties, restore what could be restored, but this time as a man who knew the price of silence. He looked up. The clouds had thinned to ribbons, sunlight spilling through them like forgiveness. He took off his hat and let the light touch his face. "I will not waste another season," he said to the wind. And the wind, as if answering an old prayer, carried back a faint scent of lavender. London did not announce his return with trumpets. It met Adrian Harland at the gates with its ordinary noise. Hooves on wet stone, a paperboy shouting headlines, the river muttering its old sermon. And then, as if reconsidering him, it softened. He rode the last street to Harland House, bareheaded, rain pearls drying on his hair, and thought of the sentence he had said to the wind on the road, "I will not waste another season." The house received him with the politeness reserved for prodigals who own the deed. Curtsies, candles, a fire coaxed awake, and yet something in its long corridors felt different, as though the walls, too, were learning humility. By morning, he had sent 2 notes, one to the architect who had promised for years to draw plans for a school library in the poorest quarter, and never been paid to begin. The second to Eliza Ashdown, posted to the Whitcomb Street address she had written on her latest letter. His words were simple. "I will hold a small gathering in 3 days' time to open a library that should have existed long ago. If your schedule permits, walk with me afterward to the beach garden. I would like to put something back where it belongs. A." The city moved forward without waiting for replies. Workmen arrived at dawn, blue chalk on their fingers, and a sort of merciful cheer in their talk. By noon, planks and plaster were being measured in the manse's long unused gallery. By evening, shelves stood where trophies once posed. He had never liked the word philanthropy. It had too much polish to be practical. He decided to call this repair. On the third afternoon, carriages deposited the necessary donors and the unnecessary witnesses. Adrian had asked the musicians to stay home. The air itself would have to learn a quieter song. He stood before the new shelves with a paper in his hand he did not intend to read. Children, invited from the workrooms in the nearby parish, hovered at the threshold, hatless and stunned by the quantity of books. One little girl in a faded red ribbon reached for a spine, as if asking permission to touch a star. Eliza arrived without a sound. He felt her before he saw her, the way a man sometimes senses weather. She wore a gown the color of stormlight and a shawl that looked borrowed from an honest winter. Years had made her more precise. She seemed composed of choices rather than habits. "Miss Ashdown," he said softly, stepping toward her. "You came." "I'm on my way to the academy," she answered, and though her mouth found the polite shape of a smile, her eyes watched him carefully, assessing scaffolding, searching for true beams. "I can spare an hour, perhaps two." "Then we must spend them correctly," he said, and offered his arm, not as possession, but as proposition. She accepted. The donors watched and whispered, not quite sure what story they were being asked to tell later. Adrian ignored them and led her to the shelves. "For years," he said, "I filled these rooms with things meant to announce that I existed. Today I would rather they forget me and remember only usefulness." He nodded to the steward who opened the doors. Children entered the way people used to enter churches. They dispersed with small, reverent cries. "Look at this one. Listen to this. May I take it home?" And the room learned a new music. "They will return the books with the devoutness of thieves who have decided to go honest," Eliza said, and the corner of her mouth warmed. "What will you call it?" "Not mine," he answered. "It will do to name the building for Harland, but the heart of it, this, should wear another name." He glanced at her. "If you allow it." Her chin lifted a fraction. "What name does your grace propose to borrow?" "The Wild Rose Room," he said, "for the seal that taught me what truth is, and for the woman who used it as a window latch rather than a weapon." The smallest silence followed, one that pricked rather than bruised. Then she laughed under her breath. "You do have a talent for ceremony." "I am learning ceremony that serves," he said. "We can engrave it later. Today is for use." A child, hair like wheat, approached with a book so large it seemed to carry him. "Sir, your grace, may we really keep them a whole week?" "A fortnight," Adrian corrected gently, and the boy nodded as if a new moon had been added to the sky. When the formalities threatened to grow teeth, Adrian bowed to the donors, thanked them with clinical accuracy, and asked his steward to finish what he had begun. Then he turned to Eliza. "Walk with me?" They left by the side door and crossed the lawn. The afternoon had chosen clarity. Light lay clean on the grass, and the house behind them seemed relieved to be ignored. He led her to the beach garden, the place where rain had blessed their promise once and pride had later come to live. The trees remembered both. "I used to come here," he said, "when I had convinced myself that anger was a religion. I prayed badly." "And what did your angry God ask of you?" she asked. "Obedience," he said, "and deafness." They reached the old stone bench. The beech leaves shivered a greeting no human throat could reproduce. He faced her. "You wrote that my certainty wounded you more than my suspicion. I have thought about that sentence until it has learned to walk in my sleep." She watched him, neither yielding nor defending. He drew a small wrapped parcel from his coat and held it out. "I would like to put something back where it belongs," he said. "Not this object, though that too, but what it means." She hesitated, then accepted the parcel. The paper yielded to her fingers. Inside lay a locket, not the heavy gold one he had once given, and she had returned, but a simple silver oval polished thin by handling. She looked up. "I bought it from a penny jeweler on the road," he said. "Plain enough to tell the truth. The miniature inside is not a portrait." He nodded for her to open it. She did. Inside, under thin glass, lay a pressed sprig of lavender and a small scrap of ticket, browned with age, the print barely legible. "Your brother's passage," he said, "and the scent that kept me honest today. I asked a man in France, through another man, to find a record. I have no right to any of it, but I thought, if you wished, the locket might hold the two proofs you should never have had to prove to me." that you saved a life, and that you were always yourself." Her fingers trembled, not with sentiment, but with a precision that comes when a balancing scale at last finds center. "You searched for him." "I did. He sent back a single line. 'I live, and so does my shame.' I sent another, 'Live better then.' It is not my talent to heal other men, but it seemed wrong to leave that window unlatched." Eliza closed the locket and held it, thumb worrying the seam as if testing whether it would open again. "This is not atonement," she said quietly. "I know. It is not purchase. I know that too. It is thorough," she finished, and warmth touched her voice. "You always did favor careful work when you cared about the result." "I am learning to care with my hands, not only with sentences," he said. "May I?" He stopped himself. "No, you will decide what I may." She stood quite still. Then she stepped closer, so that the beach drifted its shade across both of them, and the world grew small enough to be careful with. "There is a rule in my classroom," she said. "When someone finally tells the truth, the others stop talking long enough to hear it. Do you know what follows? Quiet. Respect." She lifted her face. "You asked in your note whether I could spare an hour. Will you spend the next one slowly with me? No speeches, no charity I have not asked for. Come to the academy on Thursday. Read with the younger girls. Argue with the older ones about endings. If you want more of me, earn more of the hours." He bowed his head. "I would rather earn minutes honestly than seize years by habit. And this garden," she added, almost smiling, "is no longer a temple for pride. If you must pray here, pray for patience." He laughed, a sound she had once coaxed from him with ease, and which now returned like a friend with news. "Very well." They sat on the stone bench, not touching, not performing, simply occupying the same square of weather. Leaves ticked. A bee attempted theology above a blossom and gave up, satisfied by honey. At length he said, "I have grown used to the house echoing me. It is an education to hear it echo you instead." "Then I will speak often enough to refine its taste," she said, and there, at last, was the gleam in her gaze that had once taught him what courage looked like when dressed as playfulness. He turned, and the impulse to reach for her arrived, not as demand, but as discovery. "Eliza," he said softly, "may I?" He hesitated again, corrected himself. "Would it be welcome if I kissed you?" She regarded him in the blessed, unbearable silence of decision. Years collapsed into a single measured breath. Then she said, "Yes, Adrian, as long as it is not an ending, but a beginning." He touched her as one touches a threshold, reverent, exactly, aware of both rooms it connected. The kiss did not rehearse the past. It wrote a first sentence for something that would require more pages than pride permits. It tasted of rain remembered and summers unspent, of ink and patience, of the ordinary sweetness we call home once we are finally brave enough to mean it. When they parted, she rested her forehead to his for a moment that life could not afford, but love could. "Thursday," she said, "and do not arrive with bouquets. Bring books." "Books," he repeated, smiling. "No flowers, unless they come pressed inside." "Those I accept," she said, fingers brushing the locket. "We always were better at paragraphs than petals." From the main lawn came the distant sound of children shouting a victory that belonged to no one game in particular. Eliza stepped back. "I must go. If I'm late, 20 girls will mutiny, and London will fall." "Then go," he said, joy making him careless of dignity. "I will write a defense for the city." She began to walk. He watched, bright with the quiet kind of happiness that does not need witnesses. At the garden's gate, she paused, looked over her shoulder, and said the only sentence that mattered more than "I love you" when spoken after a long grief. "I'll see you soon." He stayed in the beach shade until the sun tilted and the house's windows flashed once like applause. On his way back across the grass, he passed a small table where the engraver had left proofs for the bronze plaque. He lifted the top sheet and read the words, "The Wild Rose Room," and below, a line he had added at the last minute, "Truth is the window, love is the latch." He signed off on the letters, not because he believed plaques change the world, but because he had seen a girl in a red ribbon today touch a book as if it were a door handle to a larger house. He wanted doors everywhere. That evening, while London rehearsed its night, he sat at his desk and wrote not a proclamation, not a defense, but a single invitation. Thursday at 3. We will read the chapter where the heroine gets lost, and then decides to enjoy the forest. I would value your corrections. A. He sanded the ink, sealed the envelope with wax, and did not reach for the crest of thorns. He pressed instead the little stamp he had bought from a stall near Covent Garden, a wild rose, stubborn and unmanageable, blooming where it pleased. When the footman carried the letter into the city, the house felt different, not grander, simply alive. The first Thursday was a lesson in restraint. Adrian arrived with a satchel of well-thumbed books and a promise he kept in his pocket rather than his mouth. The girls at the academy received him the way one receives a handsome portrait that has unexpectedly learned to speak, with awe first, then curiosity, and finally mischief. He read to the younger class in a voice careful of commas and small hearts. He argued with the older girls about heroines who mistake pride for principle and about endings that insist upon being earned. Eliza watched from the doorway, arms folded lightly, a smile that did not congratulate so much as approve. One mustn't rescue a heroine too quickly, she reminded him as they walked the corridor afterward. It makes villains lazy. Then I will be industrious, he said. I have a long apprenticeship. Thursdays repeated themselves with a gratitude that felt like grace. He learned the names of the students who hid fierceness inside quiet, the ones who disguised fear with chatter, the one who wrote verses in margins, and the one who insisted numbers could sing if given the right staff. He discovered, to his gentle astonishment, that usefulness tastes like joy. At Harland House, the wild rose room filled with hands and voices and pages that came back wrinkled from weather and life. On the bronze plaque, small fingers traced the raised letters as if reading were a kind of climbing. He and Eliza advanced by inches, a discipline that confounded London and satisfied them. They walked in public gardens where roses did not inquire into reputations. They argued amiably about a sentence he placed too heavily on the page and a silence she thought he honored too much. They learned to disagree without reaching for old weapons. On the fourth Thursday, when a sudden shower scattered the academy into a cheerful chaos, he offered her his arm, not as escort but as shelter. She accepted it with a glance that said, "This, too, is a vow." Society, starved of scandal, invented one made of patience. "They are clearly in love," a countess declared at tea, which is the dullest form of drama. A poet disagreed. "No," he said, "it is the only kind that lasts long enough to matter." And London, being London, applauded both. Summer turned itself like a page. The beech leaves learned a new green. The city rehearsed a softer light. When Adrian suggested a small ceremony in the garden, only the necessary witnesses, the trees, the plaque, your head mistress, and whoever must be present to make it legal. Eliza looked at him for a long, quiet moment, and then nodded once, as if agreeing with a line a book had been trying to say for chapters. They were married on a morning that took the trouble to be kind. Mrs. Talbot sniffed and pretended the pollen had insulted her. The girls from the academy lined the path, each holding a sprig of lavender, as if hope were best managed in handfuls. There were no trumpets, no diamonds, no published accounts. The vows were simple and correct. Adrian's voice did not falter on "for better," though his hands trembled at "forgive." Eliza's mouth curved when she said to keep truth as our home even when it rains. The beech trees approved in their leafy way. The plaque looked briefly like a friend who hears good news and declines to interrupt. Afterward, he placed no ring heavy enough to argue with the past. Instead, he lifted the plain silver locket he had given months earlier and fastened it at her throat. "For what you saved," he said, "and for what I will not lose again." She touched the oval with 2 fingers. "For what we tend," she corrected. "Love is a garden, not a trophy." They kept their old addresses a little while, not out of doubt, but from a sense that endings should be meticulously folded, not crumpled. Her room over the bookshop remained a room for writing and remembering. His house learned to be a home in ordinary hours. By autumn, she moved into Harland House without fanfare. The staff adjusted with relief. A mistress who read with the footman's children and insisted on warm bread in the servants' hall, was an answer to prayers no one had dared write down. The first winter together was the kind people misremember as perfect because it had the decency to heal without exhibitions. There were nights by the library fire when she scribbled notes in the margins of his speeches, and he crossed out 3 adjectives in her essay, and they accused each other of crimes against prose with grins that sat easily on their faces. There were mornings when he rose before dawn to ride the slow circuit of tenants' cottages, learning names and roofs, returning with cold cheeks and news that mattered. Afternoons when she brought the academy girls to see the presses at the printers so they could watch ideas become ink and ink become voice. He made amends the way she preferred, in structures, a new roof for a widow who had outlived her sons, a fund that paid for girls' examinations quietly, receipts filed without ceremony. A law argued in a parliament that disliked being corrected by compassion, protecting schoolhouses from seizure when wealthy men wished to widen streets. He did not put their names on any of it. "If we ever require applause," Eliza said, "we shall clap for one another at breakfast." He clapped, and the eggs went a little cold, and neither minded. Their quarrels, when they found them, had the measured temperature of people who intend to remain in the room. Once, after a committee meeting where a baron had complimented Eliza's intelligence with the careful malice of a man who expects a cookie for noticing the sky, Adrian came home in a wrath that made the decanters nervous. "He spoke to you as if you were a bright pet," he said, pouring regret back into the bottle. "I should have corrected him publicly," she suggested, arching a brow, "and rewarded his posture with spectacle. No, better to draft the charter that will render his compliments obsolete." She put a hand over his. "Do not spend yourself in fires that only warm the wrong people." He laughed then, low and unproud. "Married less than a year, and I am already quoting you at myself." "Good," she said. "It saves me breath." When spring returned, they opened the garden to the neighborhood. Children chased one another between beds. Women with tired eyes sat in the beech shade and let the world be gentle for an hour. The Wild Rose Room kept losing books and gaining readers. No one minded the exchange. On the anniversary of the library's opening, the engraver delivered a second plate, a modest edition Eliza had requested without telling him. Beneath the original line, "Truth is the window, love is the latch," a new sentence shimmered. "Forgiveness is the door we are brave enough to open twice." "Twice?" he asked, amused. "Once for each of us," she said, and kissed him the way a woman kisses the life she elected, not the dream she inherited. On another Thursday, the post brought a letter with Belgian stamps. Adrian opened it with a steadiness he had manufactured for the moment. "I live," her brother wrote, "and the life is better. I am ashamed less often and useful more. I think of your kindness as a debt I pay forward rather than back. Tell my sister that the world has not finished with us yet, and that is the best news." Eliza read it twice, looked out the window a long moment, and then folded the paper into the locket alongside the ticket scrap. She said nothing for an hour, and in that hour, everything she did not say felt like peace. They visited the sea when London grew loud. On the shingle, with the wind attempting to teach the water new manners, Eliza walked ahead and left prints the waves hurried to memorize. Adrian watched, content with the study of a woman who had taught a duke how to be a man. "You are smiling at nothing," she called over her shoulder. "What has pleased you?" "Your end," he answered. "My end. You insist on a world that makes room for more than one truth, justice and mercy, duty and delight, history and hope." He caught up, took her hand, and let the sea approve. "I was built for ore. You have made me fluent in and." They did not speak often about the night everything broke. When they did, it was with a care that honored both the wound and the skin that had grown across it. "I'm not sorry for protecting him," she said once, "only for assuming I had to do it without you." "And I'm not sorry for loving you enough to rage," he said, "only for calling rage-proof." "Then let us keep the lesson and discard the scourge," she replied, and he understood that some sentences are marriages. Years, which had once punished, now practiced being kind. The academy expanded. Girls who had read in the Wild Rose Room returned as teachers with ink on their fingers and light in their eyes. Tenants' children learned to ask questions that would have frightened their grandfathers. The city, schooling itself slowly, discovered that dignity multiplies when shared. On a quiet evening, after the house had settled into its comfort and the garden had traded gossip with the dark, Adrian retrieved from a drawer a box he had kept too long. Inside lay the old gold locket, the one with weight and want and history. He brought it to the beach bench where they had first rewritten the world and set it between them. "We never spoke of this," he said. "It belongs wherever you wish it to belong." She regarded the object that had once advertised a promise and later curated a pain. "We have a better one now," she said, touching the silver oval at her throat. "Let the old one retire with honors." She placed it gently into the hollow of the bench, as if the stone had always been a shelf for endings, and they sat with it in companionable memory. He had brought with him a small packet, folded pages bound with ribbon the color of twilight. "What is that?" she asked. "A scandalous document," he said, straight-faced. "Drafts of speeches you improved. I intend to publish them as a pamphlet on useful eloquence." "And who will receive credit?" "You," he said, "under a name of your choosing, or no name at all." She looked at him with the amusement of a woman who has selected her life carefully and finds it continuing to choose her back. "Call it The Window and the Latch. No author. Let people think the garden wrote it," he laughed. "The garden did write it. On the anniversary of their first letter, they hosted no celebration. They walked to the beach garden at dusk and read quietly for an hour. He, a novel too generous to be fashionable; she, a slim book of verses that refused to apologize for tenderness. When the light was almost gone, he closed his book and said the sentence he had been keeping for the right minute, not the loudest. "I swore I would never forgive you," he murmured, voice low enough to invite the night to keep a secret. "Because I did not know how to forgive myself. Your letter changed everything, not because it excused me, but because it taught me the grammar of mercy." He turned to her. "Thank you for opening the window." She laid her palm against his chest over the pocket where, even now, he kept the folded blue page like a compass. "And thank you," she said, "for learning that the latch is not a lock." They sat until the stars embarrassed the nave. Chandeliers of every ballroom in London. Somewhere in the city, a girl started a book she would not be told to put down. Somewhere by the sea, a brother wrote a better line. Somewhere in Parliament, a small law with a quiet heart leaned toward passing. And in a garden that had once hosted pride, two people practiced the ordinary miracle of continuing. When they finally rose, the bench kept their shape a moment, as if reluctant to release it. They walked back toward the lit windows of a house that had learned new manners, and Eliza laughed softly, for no good reason, and every right one. "What is it?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. And then, because she owed nothing to caution anymore, she added, "Everything." They crossed the threshold together,